I will try to introduce him a bit. You know that this guy is responsible for the Trailblazer. If you don't know what is it, probably Nick will tell it because I don't know. This guy have a lot of slides, 1,000 stars on the GitHub. I don't know why, maybe because he is doing that all the time and fully time, only open sources. Or maybe because he is good to teach and speak about drinking beer all the time. Okay, so go. But I have one cool story. I have to tell it. It's that guy who, on the conference Wrocław last year, he brings and share beers with the other attendees. Okay, it wasn't morning because it was third and fourth presentation that day. But I remember that Czarek was really happy that you bring him this healing potion. So thanks.
Don't walk away, I need the microphone. Okay, thank you so much. I wasn't aware if this is going to be a conference or a meetup, because I was being explained that this is a meetup. It's a bit more than expected. This is why I have awesome slides with me. It's all because of you. I wanted to give a professional conference talk and not just a meetup presentation. Sorry for drinking beer on stage, but I just had to give 3 hours of workshop where we already drank beers, but it's not professional to mention that in the talk. So I was really thirsty afterwards, and that's what I need to do that on stage. And it would be nice if you every now and then you just start randomly applauding and clapping and yelling. Thank you, because otherwise I'm going to fall asleep. Yeah, so there's this massive problem in my life that it's not alcoholism, that's not a problem. There's this problem in my life that, I was kind of talking about what to speak at this conference, work, meetup, whatever. And Mariusz told me, please don't talk about the same stuff you talk about in the workshop, because some people will be bored. And I was kind of wondering, okay, what should I talk about? About the neuroscience or about quantum physics? It's all hobbies of mine, of course. So I'm basically talking about the same stuff I did at the workshop. Whoever was at the workshop, I recognize a few faces. You will be bored to death. Everyone else will be, I don't know, entertained till the end. By the way, why were you not at the workshop? Like, this is, I don't know. I'm not sure if I should be pissed off. What, is private? It's Friday. Does that? So that means on Friday you don't want to think. That's why you don't go to workshop. Okay, so I had to change this talk a little bit to make it not do the not represent the exact content that we had in my workshop. So I added a lot of, I built this like in a chronological way through the open source career of Trailblazer, hence the name. Sorry, this is also really beautiful, right? It's, wow, it's so nice. Oh, 3 people like it. Okay, so I kind of built this talk in a chronological way where I show some waypoints of the open source career of Trailblazer. And that's not only me, there's also a few other poor people. And I want to start with the most exciting compliment I ever got. That was, people kept calling me or our projects architecture astronaut. And that, I don't know, I find astronauts pretty cool. They also have hobbies like neuroscience and quantum physics. But it apparently was meant as an insult several times throughout my life. So I don't know, we will re-encounter this architecture astronaut term because that's basically everything in Trailblazer is too much abstraction. And if you do too much abstraction, you're apparently an astronaut. But anyway, so in order to understand the history of Trailblazer, we have to go back in my life. I mean, maybe not that, maybe, yeah, this is enough. Like, this is me, look at me, I'm young, I'm full of passion, I have no wrinkles. You can see that I was drinking twice the amount that I'm drinking today, and I was still fit. That's like 2006 or something. You can tell because it's not 4:3, the picture is still like the old, I don't know what it was, like 1024 by 768 or something like that. So that's me in probably my first conference tour or something. And that was when I was presenting about the Cells Gem. It's impossible to find the logo that someone created for us back then. People would actually create logos for projects they liked. This is not happening anymore. If anyone can find the old logo, it was great. It said Cells, and then it said insert awesome slogan here, and we just kept it that way. It was great, but I couldn't find it anymore. So Cells was kind of my first encounter with my style of software architecture and the community. It was a long time ago. You saw the photo. And so what Cells is meant for is something like you have a web application. So you have HTML views, and that is before React and what else? Bone breaker, backbone, and all this kind of stuff. So this is when you had like HTML fragments, like something like a sidebar or a navigation bar, and you wanted to encapsulate that particular view component. Spoiler alert! You wanted to model that in a component, basically. So like a sidebar or a navbar. That's what I wanted to have as a component, like a real component. And what I got from Rails was this partial, like you render something like a navbar partial, and you pass in like the current user, or you use instance variables. And I mean, it was kind of, there was no interface or anything. It just like there's a partial, and the partial can access everything, and then the partial was some ERB or Slim or Haml or Slim 2 or Haml 5. Fuck this shit. And then in that partial, you could call helper methods. I mean, actually, sorry, I switched to Tailwind, so it's much easier to read than this. Oh, sorry. So yeah, so the partial is calling. Like usually you want to have some logic not in the view but somewhere, and so you call a helper. And wait, what is going on here? There we go. And the helper is in the Rails it's still the same architecture. It's a module, and the module has methods, and this helper, like avatar4, for example, is available throughout the entire application. And you have to be careful if you in your navbar you use avatar4, and in your sidebar you would use another avatar4. You have a problem because it's not encapsulated. It's just there's no interfaces. And I really hated this because I wanted to have something standalone, like a view component that you can use anywhere in your application without having to look. Oh, am I overriding a method with my global helper or whatever? And I was asking in the community, hey, what's the way of doing this? Back then we didn't have, I don't know, like real-time chats or ChatGPT. It was like mailing lists, and then people were telling me, hey, this is just the way we do it. Partials, it's great. Like, you don't need more encapsulation. It's just not what DHH likes in Basecamp, so we don't need it. And I was really angry with this, and luckily I found a small script. It was called Cells from Ezra Zygmuntowicz. He sadly passed away a few years ago, but he kind of had this view component code in like 20 lines of code. It was really crappy, but it was kind of the concept I was looking for. It was like a standalone component that I can render anywhere in my Rails stack. So the idea was you call render cell, and then you say what cell you want to render, and you pass into that cell what you want the cell to know, not the other way around. Not the cell asking, hey, give me the current user from some magic global stack. It's like you have to pass it into the cell. And the cell was, this code is not correct. Stop copying it on your laptops. This is not correct code. And so basically the cell was a class. So object orientation in the view, oh my goodness. And so what you could do is like you could render partials from that class. It's like a mini controller, and it looked exactly the same like a partial. So you had, for example, I still have this avatar4 in the cell view. And that helper was not sitting in a global module. It was actually also sitting in that cell. So it was an instance method. And you can see by the way the arrows go, you all studied computer science, so it's like an enclosed system. There's no access to the outer world. It's just a beautiful component that doesn't break with your application code. I could have 15 cells in the same page with 15 different avatar4 implementations, and it works. So that was kind of the idea that I wanted to have. And thanks to Ezra's code, I was able to program it. I was really bad at, I mean, still really bad at programming, but like back then I didn't even know what is, I don't know, a namespace in Ruby or something like that. But what I finally managed is that you could also test this cell component in a test. So you could run that component. It would give you HTML, and you can assert selector. Assert selector didn't exist back then, but you could say, like, is my HTML showing the right avatar? And you can run that cell in any environment, and it will always give you the same content. And that was what I wanted. I'm still looking for the cells logo. It's everything but the one I need. Is anyone any success already? Okay, terrible. So what was funny was that DHH liked this idea. So he emailed me, like out of the blue, that he was digging cells. It was pretty cool. I was pumped. It was like, you saw the photo. I was a kid knowing like 3 lines of Ruby, and wow. So he said, like, it's a great fit for Rails core. It could be. But at the same time, trolling started. Actually, I got so much bad responses on my blog. I had this funny blog back then. No one blogs anymore. It's like Mastodon. Lol. So yeah, so it's like, hey, we don't need that, blah, blah, blah. Partials are great. You're nuts. Like, what is going on? Like, why are you introducing abstractions? Really, people were not, they were actually not liking. I mean, there were a couple of people who were fans of it, and they were starting to use it, but most people were really aggressive. The community 20 years ago was quite aggressive. Speaking of aggressive. Hey, I can do this again. So yeah, it's one of those things I realized in the Ruby community, or maybe in every software developer community, is like, oh, there's something new. Go away. I don't want that. That's something I have to learn. I'm scared, so fuck off. Oh, are we on video? Yeah, sure. And what's really interesting is, like, 20 years later, GitHub copied the idea, and it's called View Component. It has the exact same API, the exact same concepts, the exact same template engine, the exact same API name. It's great. And suddenly people jump on that. It's like, wow, we have View Components in Rails, finally, after 20 years of messing around with partials. So it's kind of, it needs this big company like Shopify or GitHub or Basecamp to give us like ideas for something new. Because if some random open source developer works on something, could be dangerous. He's not making $1 million, so no. So I mean, I'm actually happy that View Components exists. Finally, the idea of components make it into the view layer. I could be angry, but that's my nick 10 years ago. Now I don't care. I'm happy that someone picked up the idea. Okay, so that was my first experience, and it went over many years. Cells, it's a trivial gem, but it was a nightmare to make people excited about it, because it's a new abstraction that you don't need in your application, apparently. My next adventure was parsing and deserialization. Parsing is deserialization. Parsing and serializing something like JSON or XML. So my problem was, you have documents and like a JSON API document, and in order to make that document being rendered, you have to override SJSON somewhere deep in Rails, and sometimes you have to add an if because you don't want SJSON to be overwritten in that case, but in that case, so it was like you have to override globally SJSON. And I really hated this, and it was not a good way of serialization. And also the other way around, like when you have a document coming in and you want to work with that document, for example, to validate it, you need to parse that into some object graph. I mean, that's happening automatically currently in Rails in the params parser middleware, in case you're interested. Maybe they renamed it. But the problem was there was no API or no abstraction for parsing. So that's I mean, maybe you think I'm nuts. I already said it on the slide, but parsing a document into an object graph is the most hardest part of software engineering, and we don't have any abstraction for that in Ruby. So my idea was, hey, let's introduce something called representer. And what you do is you declare the format of your document, like title and content is for a blog post, and then the blog post can have comments, and they have content and user ID, and it doesn't make sense, the example, but whatever. And the API you were using publicly was you get a posting, like a blog posting, and then you use representer.new, pass in that object and say to JSON, and it will use the representer to give you the beautiful document that we just saw. And you can also use that the other way around. You can say, here's a empty posting, and I want to pass the JSON into an object graph. And it would do the same using the same representer instructions to grab data from that document. And so again, so giving you an object graph of like a posting with comments and this kind of stuff. And then obviously people were asking for something like, hey, I don't know, in this particular case for content in a comment, I want to remove new lines or something, and then you could add parse filters per property, so you could declaratively configure how parsing and rendering works through a class and not through overriding global methods somewhere. Who knows the chomp method? No one knew it in my workshop. 1 person, 2, 3. Okay, 12. Great. Let's do a chomp, like a chomp meetup later at the bar or something. I'm paying. So anyway, so you had this. So the idea was a class to parse and to render, and you can configure that class declaratively with, like, so to speak, callbacks to customized parsing and rendering. You could also use the same for XML. It's funny, people hate XML, but recently it's picking up again. I do XML sometimes when I'm hungover. It's great. So you could basically use the same representative for JSON and XML by just replacing the module, and no one ever used that, but it was possible. But anyway, the idea was, again, I have something I can test in isolation. I can use that representative, first person is leaving. I can use that representative in a unit test without a controller, without action view rendering or whatever. And I can say, render something, and it should look like that, and pass something, and it should be like a posting with a title, and the title should be a suggestion of the day. And that's how I test the representer. So the idea, again, same as a cell. I run it in a unit test. There's no environment needed, and it works. And I can rely on that in any environment. And this was actually picked up pretty quickly because people like the idea of representers, and they like the idea of parsing, but then people started to write 500 different serializer implementations, active model serializer, I don't know the other names, but there were like 50 other gems, but they were all focusing on serialization. But I found that parsing was the harder part. But at least, again, people picked up the idea, okay, rendering doesn't have to happen in some magic global method as JSON. It can be, its own class. So I like that. The third kind of milestone in the history of Trailblazer is that was a tumbleweed. Was the reform gem. While I have a sip, you can think about what I just said. Oh yeah, the random cheers. I forgot. Falling asleep here. So the idea in reform was, so you can already, I hope you can already see the path this is taking. The idea in reform was, how do we handle visual HTML forms with individual validations? Do we want that in the model, or do we want to have that in a separate class? And of course, we want to have it in a separate class. So Rails told us, hey, just use a form builder and use the automatic parsing that is in params parser, and then use update attributes to assign the incoming form, and then use validations in the model. But you can also like fine-tune it. If you don't want that validation to be happening, just add an if to the model class, and it was such a mess. So again, so that was actually when collaboration started. People were helping me. So we had this idea, there's this form. There's validations, let's put that in a class, and that class is only responsible for that particular use case. That is what object-oriented programming is made for. And you see it's the same kind of API. You have title and you have content, so you describe what the form looks like, and you have validations in that form, only for that use case. And the API was roughly something like, you instantiate the form, and then you can ask the form to validate incoming parameters. So that was what usually happened when you said model.update attributes. But here, only the validations are run that you put into that class. And you can say form.save, and it would push the parameters to the model and save it. So that's kind of the idea in a nutshell. And that's where I should have stopped with reform, but I added more and more shit, and now I have to deprecate everything, whatever. But again, like we're coming back to the same thing. Like, I wanted something I can test in isolation without having to touch the entire Rails stack. So you have a posting model. You give that to the form, and then you can call validate, you can call, I don't know, save, and you can unit test that form object, not some random global model that is doing the logic for you. So that was kind of the idea. And like, I mean, it's starting to be boring. I'm actually really glad I used the white background for the source code, because apparently black on white works better than white on black. It's a highly professional presenter. It's probably 20 years old. It's like me. Chuckling. Again, DHH liked Reform. It was crazy. So we were emailing, and he said, yeah, blah, I kind of like the idea. I don't like accepts nested attributes, which makes me almost love him. I like him, but love is far away. He never kissed me on the mouth. So we were kind of emailing, and there was this funny, I mean, I didn't put that in the talk, but there was this funny thing that some Google Summer of Code student copied Reform and branded it into Rails core, and he uploaded it to the Rails core GitHub repository, and there was this huge outcry, like, hey, someone is stealing Reform, and blah, 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 and DHH sorted it out. So I'm still thankful for that. He was actually behaving like an adult. It's how millionaires work. Okay, so but anyway, so those beautiful concepts I was using, or we were using because people started to join. It's called encapsulation. It's nothing special. It's like, okay, there is this huge app. I have no clue how this app works. I have this small problem. Let's solve this small problem either in a function, in a functional environment, or with an object, in an object-oriented environment. But that object has no access to the outer world. Okay, that's the idea of encapsulation. So my kind of takeaway was, if I'm writing something and I can test that in a unit test without creating this massive HTTP environment, if I can test it in isolation, I did a good job in encapsulating it. And that is kind of how the brain works. Like, the brain doesn't work with, I understand everything at once. It's more like the brain wants to solve small problems. And we're really good at, cutting and categorizing things, but the brain doesn't want to understand your entire application. If my navigation bar doesn't work because it shows the wrong avatar, I don't want to look in callbacks in Active Record. I want to know, where's the view for that? Ah, here, we have a cell. Okay, look at the cell. Oh, it's using the wrong method on the model. Oh, I can write a unit test for that. That's great. I don't have to test the entire stack. Well, that's kind of, it sounds, I mean, it's trivial, and it is trivial, but the Ruby community was so reluctant to accept this. Like, we can use isolation and encapsulation for free in Ruby because Ruby is built around objects, so why don't we use it? And so, I mean, Reform was kind of getting quite popular because it's really something missing in Rails or in Ruby in general, form objects, especially renderable form objects. And so kind of Trailblazer started to pick up a little bit of momentum. Trailblazer didn't exist yet. It was still a collection of like a few gems, like representable and cells and this kind of stuff. So the next problem we tackled was callbacks. So it's the same effect I was using in Roslav. People were applauding, standing up, throwing bottles at me because of this comic character. But yeah, anyway. So the problem was, I don't want my active record object to know about too much business logic. Like, what happens after I save? I don't even know if after save exists. I just put in some random shit. So before I call create on an active record model, or after I validated something, I don't want to put that into a global class because there's always different contexts. I use a particular model, like posting. It should actually be posting, not postings. This is how much I know Rails. So I didn't like the idea of having business logic in a global class. And the same, I mean, the problem went further because some people didn't use callbacks, they used controllers, and they put in all the business code into the controller, because where else would you put it? So, I mean, don't look at this code, it's just some random crap like people are reading, like, hey, create mailer, how does it work? It's like random. But the idea was, there's like a lot of if and else in controller actions, because people need a lot of code when they create a blog post, for example. Like, you don't want to create a blog post. You want to create a blog post. You want to validate. You want to send out an email a notification. You want to create a Slack for that blog post and save it in the database. And you want to probably create a PDF after everything was successful in a Sidekick job. And that all happened in the controller. And so we had this community that started to grow from 1 to 3. I mean, 1, 2 without a W, 3. And we started to think, okay, how can we solve that problem? And again, the same idea. Let's introduce an object or a class that solves this problem of what code are we running when we want to create a blog post. And you can see we introduced a new concept we call operation, and that's where Trailblazer kind of started to spin off. So the idea, like cells, like reform, like representable, is the same. You have some entry point, and you call that entry point, and that entry point will either render a cell or render a JSON document or whatever, or in this case, it will run all the necessary code to create a blog post. So the controller is free of like code. And this is because, I mean, I was applying the same concept again. I can write a unit test for this without HTTP. That must be right? I mean, it makes so much sense. So again, if you can test it in isolation, you're on the right path. So the problem was that in the first version of Trailblazer, we literally, I mean, there were lots of like helpers and stuff, but we kind of made people push everything they had in the controller into the process instance method. And so the code was, I mean, that was 100 times better than before because you had an isolated object, but you still had a huge mess of if and else, and if the validation failed, do that, and if the PDF generation is broken, do this. So, I mean, I knew it's kind of not ideal, and you can look at this code, it looks like crap on the right-hand side, but at least it's isolated, okay? At least I can test this code in a unit test, and I have to be aware what variables, what objects do we need inside of that class. So the problem was, I started writing a book about Trailblazer with this old idea of having all the code sitting in the operation. That was great, but I will never do this again. Writing a book about stuff that is not finished is basically you couldn't do anything dumber. But actually, here's the original design of the book. That was me trying to draw with Minecraft. It's beautiful. But the interesting part was that it kind of was accepted really nicely in the beginning. You can tell, like 2014, and then, I don't know, maybe 2016, it stops. That's when people realized Trailblazer is shit, and they didn't buy the book. But in the beginning, it was a really nice, I don't know, like a moment of new revolutionary thinking. Oh, we have a service object that is doing only one thing, and it has only one public method. This is great. Oh my God. Oh, but it doesn't solve any problems. Okay, no, let's go back and use JavaScript for that. So here, look at me. I'm young. It's like 10 years ago. So this is Michał from, I mean, his name is probably pronounced differently. He's from Ukraine, and he is kind of the nagger in my community. Or he used to be. I haven't spoken to him in a long time. He's like, hey, Trailblazer is great, but the old API sucks. Can we get the new API? Because he didn't like the process method with all this crappy code. And I'm like, yeah, let's do this. So I also realized, like, one of the big problems is that if you want to insert more behavior into your operation or into your controller with this crappy code, you had a big problem. So what we did is we introduced that step API, that kind of a DSL, sorry, that kind of forces you to structure your code. So we were going through this for 3 hours in the workshop, and I got really thirsty. Yeah, that's the spirit. I'm missing like empty beer cans thrown at me or something like that. So the idea was, I mean, we already had people thinking in classes. So don't put your code in the controller, put it in this new service object we call operation. That was already great. So that was Trailblazer 1. And in Trailblazer 2, we started to make people have declaratively define what they want the code to behave like. And it kind of worked nicely, especially when you want to insert something. For example, after saving the posting model, I want to insert something like increase a counter. So I would literally just add a new step at that point. So it was much easier to maintain. Or you could use inheritance and you could say, I am creating a new class, create counting, which is also an operation. I inherit everything from create, plus I'm adding increase counter step after the save step. So that's also possible. So you had kind of a really, you still have, it still works. You have this declarative API to model behavior without actually having to know anything about this operation. So you still understand there are steps, and you still understand this is how I add steps without having to know what the operation actually does. And so people were kind of struggling in the beginning with the step API. So we introduced this beautiful mental image model. So, I got confused because I will tell you in a second when you see the amazing animation. And I want to hear some applause then. So the operation, we already had that. The only way to invoke that was the call method. So you say like posting operation create dot call, and then you pass in params and the current user and everything the operation needs. You have to pass in explicitly from the outside. And the operation will always only return a result object. And that result object, you could ask, were you successful or were you not successful? And then people started to ask, hey, how do you know if that was successful or not? And that's when we started to introduce the railway pattern, something I shamelessly stole from functional programming. So basically, the mental model behind an operation is like a two-track railway. And if you run everything successfully, it will go like this. And after the next, wait, next one. Because it does some deviation. And if something fails, for example, validate, it would go that way. Now we can clap. That was great. I mean, Hollywood is calling. No, it's the LibreOffice, it's great. Once you understand it. I didn't understand how to remove the smileys before the slide starts, but I will get to that. I'm doing pretty well. So you saw those two animations and you instantly understand, okay, that's the mental model behind an operation, and it's nothing we invented. It's been there for many years, and it's called railway. But you kind of get the idea. Okay, the operation allows me to define steps of my business logic, and the operation takes away the pain of control flow. So that is what Trailblazer does for you. You only implement what is happening, not when. And that was kind of a huge relief. So Michał was pretty fucked up by this. So he said, hey, why you changed the API? I said, man, you told me you want a new API and I had to change something. Yeah, but you could have done it differently. Yeah, how? Like the process method with all the code inside with ifs and else was a huge mess. So we had to do something. Yeah, but you could have done it differently. And yeah, so he's like, okay, I'm using it. It sucks, but how can we do something like nesting? I want to run an operation in an operation. I say, okay, we can do that. So hang on, this is another Hollywood quality animation. So for example, if the save step was very complex, like you have to run 500 tasks, like you're uploading something to AWS and, I don't know, recalculating a hash for the CDN, you could, you basically want an operation in the operation. So what he wanted was LibreOffice. If you have any questions for presentations, just ask me. But you have to change to Linux and only Ubuntu because it doesn't work on any other. If you compile the right kernel without Bluetooth. Okay, so what we basically did next was we have this service object that allows you to define the flow of the code. Let's allow them to nest it, and that's with the subprocess method printed in bold, and you could just pass in another operation. So that would kind of nest operations, which was a great addition. I was actually quite happy that someone suggested it. I don't know if it was Michał. I just use him as a random ranter. But so after this, I really figured out, okay, so encapsulation is great. Do you hear this bass sound? Someone is playing secretly their bass guitar somewhere. Sorry. So use encapsulation wherever you can, and never. I mean, encapsulation kind of implies don't use globals because you want to pass whatever you need inside of an operation, inside of a cell, inside of a form. You want to pass it explicitly into the constructor, into the invoking method, whatever the object looks like. But you don't want to grab that randomly out of globals. Like in controller, I always wondered, how do we know what is params? How do we know what is request? And this kind of stuff. So this was kind of the takeaway after, after we started with Trailblazer, I realized, okay, globals or magic access to variables is a source of terrible bugs. Always make people pass stuff explicitly into an enclosed environment. Encapsulation is great. Let me check. Okay, so just to give you just to make you fully understand Trailblazer, I'm sure you're all waiting to learn how the hell do those steps actually look like. I'm also kind of curious. Never seen it before. So thing is, you pass something. Holy hell! So you pass those. We said don't use globals, so you pass something like params, a current user, into the operation. And a step usually is just a method, and it has this weird interface signature. But you can access params and current user, whatever you pass into that operation. You can access that via keyword arguments. Don't worry about the implications, but that's how you kind of access variables being passed into the operation. And you can also write to the context object, we call it, and that's how you communicate stuff that goes to the outside of the operation. And whatever you write to context can be used in the following steps to do more computations. For example, I created save params, which is the params frozen. I think params are already frozen in Rails 7 because we have what's it called, strong parameters or something. But anyway, I'm good with shitty examples. And so the idea of this context that we kind of introduced with Trailblazer 2 was you have this data structure and it's being passed and passed and passed between all those steps, and you can run to the data structure and you can, change variables in the data structure, but you have this one mutable object that you use throughout the operation. And that's all you need to know how to implement steps. Chew. Again, Michał was crazy about this. He didn't like it, of course. He used it everywhere, but he didn't like it. And he said, hey, but can we also have something like mapping? So what goes into a step and what goes out of a step? We also need to take control of that. So he basically wanted to have a subset of the context being passed into a certain step and a subset of the context being extracted from that step and passed on. So I don't know, like whatever. Like we gave him in and out, so he could configure what goes into a step and what comes out of a step. He was really happy, but he's like, yeah, that's cool. It works. But I would have done it differently. I think it's reasonable, usable. But anyway, can we also have something more like I don't want to have this railway. I want to have arbitrary wiring. I want to have something like this. So actually, that was also not Michał asking for it. Again, sorry for if you ever watch this talk. So people started to ask, hey, this is pretty cool with the railway, but we sometimes want to have, for example, save having a third track going to like database error or something, so we can communicate that specific problem to the outer world. So we also gave that to the people with a small little DSL extension. And that's when I realized, okay, encapsulation is cool. Always make people pass in data explicitly, but keep your API as small as possible, because everything you add, like you saw some extensions to Trailblazer in and out and the output DSL, everything you invent, and it's cool in the first 2 days, you have to deprecate 5 days later because you find out it sucks. So give people as little public API as possible, and that's even in your application at work. If you invent this new kick-ass service object, don't make it have 15 public methods, make it have one public method, because you have to deprecate that stuff, and it sucks. Like you have to walk to 15 team members and tell them, hey, the delete method is not available anymore, it's deprecated. Or you deprecate it with a with a kernel warning or whatever, but keep your objects, like hide as much as you can inside of the object. Don't give users too many options. They will screw it up. Trust me, I know what I'm talking about, because I'm a good user. So all those new extensions being added, I think that was Trailblazer 2.1, and that was probably 7 years ago. Actually, I don't really know anymore what is time. Time is relative. It's just a continuum of, quantum theory and relativity. It's just one of my 1,000 hobbies. Bullshit. So Miha was kind of thrilled by all those extensions. The new API still sucked, but now he was complaining, I have all those new tools and I can have arbitrary wiring and I have 5 different paths the operation can take. I don't know what is going on anymore. When there's a problem, I don't know how to fix it. So what we added was we added what the fuck to operation. So if you call the operation, if you invoke the operation with what the fuck, not with call, it will all be beep, beep, beep on YouTube. So if you call the operation with what the fuck, it was creating a trace. And that was fucking amazing. So you could see in a successful case, the operation would just run and you could see all the steps the operation took. If there was a problem, you could see, validate is printed in either brown or orange, depending on how your brain works. For me, it's brown. And you could see, the operation took a different path and the validation failed. So that's where I have to start debugging. And that actually we extended that. So if there was an exception inside of one of those steps, because exceptions happen, I don't know. I mean, I know you're all perfect programmers, but I write exceptions sometimes. And so Trailblazer would also show you, hey, there was in the safe step, there was an exception. And the exception was a runtime error. Well, that's very, very verbose. But so Trailblazer would show you that. And I mean, this looks trivial in this linear operation, but if you have like a deeply nested operation, this can save you hours of debugging. And Ruby is 100 light years behind with that. I mean, we can use pry, we can use stack traces and all that kind of stuff, but the way the Trailblazer allowed debugging, and I'm so glad that, I spent 2 years of making tracing work because I basically had to rewrite everything in Trailblazer, but it was worth it because this stuff has saved me a lot of time already, and everything that saves me a lot of time probably saves other people's time. Not that I care, but... So Miha was thrilled, but now he started to ask, okay, I can see what is going on in the operation or in the operations, but I want to know exactly what the context and the variables you pass around, what they look like. So recently we built Trailblazer Pro. It's only available for $9.99 per month. No. So basically, when you run what the fuck, when you run an operation with what the fuck now, it will print a link to our debugger, our online debugger, and you can actually go visually through that trace, and you can click on particular. I mean, it looks like crap, but that's designers work for one day, and it will look amazing, like a shiny Apple OS 10. So you click on one of the steps that interests you, and you can inspect what variables went inside, what variables came out, what did they look like. So it's kind of pry level 15. So you don't have to add breakpoints, as we call it. It's all there automatically for you. Costs are like 20% of runtime. We were analyzing that in the workshop earlier. And they all signed up for it already. So I have like 25 paying customers. I mean, you know that you signed up and signed a contract, right? No? Yeah, but the free was a link with an asterisk. So yeah, so that's kind of the newest addition to the to this transformation that evolved from, hey, here's one object to handle this, here's one object to handle that, here's one object to handle that. So we kind of going more and more into the direction where Trailblazer is becoming this kind of, it's like its own programming language. And so we started to rewrite existing gems like reform, and I'm also thinking about cells to rewrite them in Trailblazer because it was bizarre in the beginning. I thought, I'm working on something, like this is not right. Like we're adding so much abstraction, but actually Ruby is so limited and so primitive that you need abstractions. And so, for example, with this tracing that I just showed, it's like, this is a tool that helps me developing, and stack traces are not helpful, especially when you're iterating or something. Trailblazer knows, hey, iteration 15 failed because params was empty in the 15th iteration. If you do that with Ruby, you will you will debug for 15 years with pry and if and else and the globals to check if you're in the 15th iteration. So I stopped thinking in the language only allows this and that, and this is best practice. So I started to think the opposite way. Like, I know it's only 2 minutes. One. So and as I just previewed, we started to go even more crazy. Like a lot of. You want to take a photo? Yeah, I always have an eye for a detail. So we actually started to use Trailblazer inside of Trailblazer. So lots of tools in Trailblazer. For example, the tracing that is sent to the online debugger is written in Trailblazer. And you can, I mean, this is just some tracing I copied, but you can see like, hey, so we use like OAuth tokens and JWT, Firebase. It's great. I learned so much about OAuth too. If you want to know anything about JWT, I'm here. Only questions about JWT. And you can see like to refresh a token or something, we just use operations, and it's so nice to see how they work by looking at the trace. So, and then also reform. I was talking about that at Wroclaw a few months ago. The new reform gem is also using Trailblazer internally, so to parse all the form properties and to validate it's just a series of steps basically, and you can insert your default behavior. I was just copying the slide. I'm not talking about it. Don't worry. But you can insert default custom behavior into a form, for example, by using Trailblazer mechanics. So once you understood how an operation works, you will understand most of the future gems because it's all using the same mechanics. And the part I'm looking forward in the next coming months is we launched Trailblazer Pro with this debugger, but we also have an editor now for BPMN, Business Modeling Notation state machines. So you can also model long-running state machines or long-running processes or business logic at any level of detail with our editor, and then this gets transformed into runtime code, and you only implement what is happening. Again, like every box you see here is one of those operations we were talking about, like create and publish and archive. This is a blog post moderation workflow. But you can't read it because the resolution is smaller than my Nokia phone, but whatever. And basically what you do is you just tell, in a Rails controller action, you just tell the state machine, hey, I want to trigger this and that action. I want to archive this and that blog post. And then Trailblazer will say, hey, hang on. You're not in the state to archive that blog post because that blog post is not even, moderated or something. So Trailblazer, again, taking care of the control flow without you having to add lots of ifs and else. A problem that we're facing a lot is that people are reluctant to change. They will always say, we don't need that. We have our own implementation. We use access state machine and we have Poro objects. Go away with your astronaut skills. Well, that's what they say. I don't know. You should give it a go. Maybe come to the next workshop. So again, to sum this up really quickly, best practices are great, but don't believe in like someone blogging and telling you the best practice we do at our company, and they may probably make billions of dollars, but that doesn't matter because best practices, that's something subjective. Yeah, you decide what feels good, and that usually means that you have full control over what is going on in your code, and I achieved that with encapsulation. I don't understand a huge Rails stack with middleware and rack and active record. I need small objects because my brain works like that, and I'm guessing your brain works probably better, but still you want small pieces of problems to be solved and not this whole thing in one like script. That's why we had PHP for. And remember that if you can test your stuff in isolation, you are on the right path. And then there's one more thing. I want all of you to come to Friendly RB in September. That's a new Ruby conference in Bucharest, being run by the creator of Avo. And I'm actually really looking forward. I will be there. And so if you haven't signed up, check it out. It's kind of a new conference. That's why a few people know about it. So give it a chance. I don't use Twitter anymore. I even deleted my account. If you want to impersonate me, go ahead. I can send you a new picture so it looks authentic. I'm on Mastodon, to be honest. It sucks, but anyway. Thank you for your for being here, and see you at the bar.
Any question? If there is any question.
We had enough questions at the workshop, I think.
Okay. So thank you, Nick.
My pleasure.
So,
So I think you are friends with Piotrek Solnica, and basically you know about dry monads and their approach to this similar problem a bit, because there's control flow and how you can deal with the ifs and those nested ifs. They have some solution for it. So what's your stance on their solution? Do you think, what's the pro for using their solution? What's the con?
Actually, the Trailblazer 2, the step stuff, was heavily inspired by dry transaction, it was called back then. So I was kind of thrilled to use their code in Trailblazer operation. And but then we kind of went in two different directions. They were really explicit about functional concepts, like you have to have this context success object being returned from every step and this kind of stuff. I mean, I could probably have wrapped that. So, and then also, I didn't like the way they do nesting. And then we started with advanced features like tracing, and this is also not possible in dry monads. We had this discussion before at the workshop. I understand that people prefer dry monads in the first 5 minutes because it's much slimmer than Trailblazer, or it appears much slimmer. But it's definitely lacking a lot of features because they are working on lots of other gems. For example, dry validation, it's a part of Trailblazer. It's not, we use it everywhere. But they're not focusing a lot on business logic. Dry monads is very, very low level. And Trailblazer is kind of trying to give you a reasonable abstraction. It also has low level API, but you saw it, it's not rocket science. So I think we are much further with usability. But I have lots of people who don't use Trailblazer in favor of dry monads, or who use Trailblazer and they hate it so much that they went to dry monads, or they wrote their own gem. So yeah, I love dry RB. I use everything they have.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Any other question? No question.